Some people are born to make the world laugh, but very few manage to do it for 8 decades. Mel Brooks is one of them, a legend of comedy, an icon of satire, a man who dared to laugh straight into the face of the things humanity once feared the most. He made audiences laugh about war, laugh about power, laugh about Hitler, laugh about evil, not to erase it, but to shrink it. Yet, there is a question rarely asked when someone spends a lifetime turning pain into laughter. What do they carry within themselves once the stage lights go dark? Behind the roaring laughter was a boy who lost his father at just 2 years old, a Jewish soldier who walked into World War II with the fear of being captured and never returning home, an artist who once vomited from anxiety, went bankrupt, and stood at the edge of despair, and a husband who lost the woman who had stood beside him for more than 40 years, the only person who truly understood him when no one else was laughing anymore. This is not just the story of a comedic genius. This is the story of the price one pays for using laughter as a means of survival. And as we trace Mel Brooks's life backward, from the poor neighborhoods of Brooklyn, through war, fame, love, and loss, perhaps what keeps us watching until the very end is not the laughter at all, but the question: is humor powerful enough to save a person from their own sorrow? Mel Brooks was born in the summer of 1926 in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn. He did not enter the world on a hospital bed, but on a kitchen table, surrounded by the smell of food, the noise of a working-class neighborhood, and the constant worries of a poor Jewish family. Just 2 years later, his father died from kidney tuberculosis. Melvin Kaminsky grew up with no memory of his father, no face to recall, no voice to imitate, no embrace from the man who should have taught him what strength looked like. That absence was never filled. On the surface, Mel was the pampered youngest child. His mother and older brothers compensated with love, with protection. But deep inside, a silent question grew louder with time. If my father had lived, would I have been different? At school and in the neighborhood, Mel was a different story altogether. A skinny, short boy with a Jewish last name, in a world where that meant being noticed, mocked, targeted. Even within his own community, he felt out of place. And then Mel found a weapon. Not fists, not physical strength, but his tongue. He learned how to observe, how to speak faster than others, how to strike first at someone's discomfort before they could strike him. Mel became the clown of the group, not because he wanted to be, but because it was the only way to belong. Years later, he would say it plainly. If I made them laugh, they wouldn't hit me. Laughter, from very early on, was no longer joy. It was a survival mechanism, a way for a small Jewish boy to endure a world that was not particularly kind, a way to turn fear into temporary power, and a way to hide a loneliness no one else could see. Many years later, when Mel Brooks created films filled with men finding one another, embracing, talking through absurd moments, he admitted that it wasn't just comedy. It was a longing to reach the shadow of a father he had never known. Mel Brooks's childhood was not marked by loud tragedy. No headlines, no shocking events. But it was precisely that quiet absence that shaped everything that came after. It taught him this: when the world gives you no place to stand, you must create one yourself, with laughter. And from that moment on, Mel Brooks began the journey of turning silent pain into a career that made the entire world laugh. When the war broke out, Mel Brooks's world was no longer the cramped streets of Brooklyn. It was a shattered Europe, mud and rubble, the stench of gunpowder, and death lurking just ahead. Mel Brooks joined the U.S. Army during World War II, not because he loved war. He hated it. But there was one thing he knew with absolute certainty. This was a war he could not stand aside from. As a Jewish man, Brooks understood exactly what was happening on the other side of the front lines. He knew the concentration camps existed. He knew names were being erased from the world simply because of who those people were. And he went into battle carrying a fear many of his fellow soldiers did not. If he were captured, he might never return. Brooks was trained as a combat engineer, one of the most dangerous roles on the battlefield. His job was to clear mines, to open paths so the infantry could advance. Every step was a gamble. Every day survived was a miracle. Even within the U.S. Army, Brooks could not fully escape prejudice. He was sometimes called by racial slurs, spoken by men who stood beside him in the same trenches. A bitter paradox. He joined the army to fight anti-Semitism, yet was forced to confront it from within. The Brooks family understood this danger all too well. When Mel's brother had to parachute from an aircraft, he removed his dog tags because they bore the letter H, short for Hebrew. A tiny mark, but enough to turn him into a target if he fell into Nazi hands. Amid all of this, Mel Brooks did not lose the one thing that helped him survive: laughter. He began doing something no one expected, mocking the enemy in the middle of war. While German forces blasted propaganda through loudspeakers, Brooks played music by Jewish singer Al Jolson over the speakers instead. Music drowned out hatred, and when the song ended, he heard small bursts of applause coming from the Allied side. It was the moment Brooks understood something that would define his life. You cannot defeat evil by imitating it, but you can weaken it by making it ridiculous. Years later, when he was criticized for daring to make comedy about Hitler, Brooks never apologized. He said it plainly: if you stand up and fight him with speeches, you're just as bad as he is. But if you make people laugh at him, you've already beaten him. It was in war that Mel Brooks discovered the true soul of comedy. Not for entertainment, not as an escape from reality, but as a way to fight fear, to remain human, while the world around him was going mad. When the war ended, Brooks returned to America with his body intact, but something inside him could never return to what it had been before. He was no longer just a young man telling jokes. He was someone who believed that laughter, when used correctly, could be a weapon more powerful than bullets. And from that battlefield, Mel Brooks stepped into his next fight, a battle with fame, pressure, and his own mind. When the war ended, Mel Brooks returned to America with a powerful conviction. If laughter could help people survive bombs and gunfire, it could also help them endure ordinary life. But ordinary life, it turned out, had enemies of its own. Brooks entered television at the exact moment American comedy was exploding. He became a writer on Your Show of Shows, a program considered the cradle of an entire generation of comedic geniuses. Surrounding him were names that would later become legends, and he himself was regarded as one of the sharpest comic minds in the room. Every week, Brooks had to outdo himself. Faster, bolder, crazier. Laughter was no longer a survival weapon. It became a measure of worth, and that pressure began to eat away at him from the inside. Brooks worked relentlessly, writing by day, writing by night, always needing to be the funniest person in the room. But when the studio lights went dark, his body began to betray him. Acute anxiety attacks struck without warning, his heart racing, sweat pouring down, breath slipping out of control. There were days Brooks vomited between parked cars on the streets of Manhattan. Moments when he ran aimlessly through the city just to burn off the adrenaline flooding his mind. He once admitted, "I was so anxious I couldn't do anything else but run or scream." This was the dark side of comedy no one ever sees on stage. When the entire world demands that you be cheerful, you are no longer allowed to be fragile. Brooks understood that if he continued this way, he would not collapse from failure, but from his own success. For the first time in his life, he sought therapy, not to become a better writer, but to survive. In that therapist's office, Brooks began to face a hard truth. He wasn't just afraid of failing. He was terrified of no longer being able to make people laugh. And that fear came from the Brooklyn boy he once was, who believed that if he stayed silent for too long, he would be abandoned. At the same time, Brooks's personal life began to crack. His career swept him away. His family was left behind. He had a wife, he had children, but he was rarely truly present. Fame arrived quickly. Connection did not. And then, when the show ended, when contracts were canceled, when the studio lights no longer shone on him, Mel Brooks faced a familiar silence. A silence he had known well since childhood. This time, laughter did not come to save him. And that was when Mel Brooks's life prepared to turn in a different direction, toward a broken marriage, unemployment, and a question hanging in the air. If you are no longer the one who makes others laugh, who are you then? As the spotlight faded, Mel Brooks returned to a life he had rarely faced in full. That of a husband, a father, and a family that needed him present, not on stage, but at the dinner table. Brooks married Florence Baum at a very young age. Together they had 3 children. It was a family formed during difficult years, when his career was still fragile and the future far from certain. By the late 1950s, everything suddenly stalled. The show ended, contracts disappeared, promising phone calls fell silent. Mel Brooks, once the comic brain of television, was now an unemployed man, with 3 children and a pile of bills. Financial pressure wore him down day by day, but the greater strain was the quiet distance growing inside the marriage. Brooks remained the same person he had always been, loud, direct, constantly craving attention. But Florence needed something else: stability, presence, a husband who could be home when night fell. The two began living beside each other, no longer in the same rhythm. In his deadlock, Brooks chose escape. In 1960, he left New York and moved to Los Angeles, staying at a friend's house, not to start over, but to run from the feeling that he was failing his own family. When Brooks returned to New York a year later, he discovered that Florence had filed for legal separation. There was no dramatic showdown, no scandal, just a marriage dissolving in exhaustion. In 1962, they officially divorced. Later in life, Mel Brooks never placed the blame on anyone. He said it simply and honestly: "We married too young." At that point, Brooks lost almost everything at once: an unstable career, a broken family, shaken faith in himself. The man who once sent entire rooms into laughter now sat alone with a question no one else could answer for him. If laughter isn't enough to keep a family together, what is left to hold on to? Yet it was precisely in that emptiness, when no one demanded that he be cheerful, that Mel Brooks began to change. He slowed down, listened more, and for the first time, allowed himself to grow up. He did not yet know what lay ahead. He did not know that soon he would meet a woman who wouldn't just love his laughter, but would understand the silence behind it. Mel Brooks's life did not rise here, but from the ruins of his first marriage, a new chapter was about to begin. with love, with understanding, and with the most glorious era of his career. After his first divorce, Mel Brooks entered a rare period of quiet. No more noise, no more pressure to prove he was the funniest person in the room, just a man learning how to slow down and listen. Then he met Anne Bancroft, not at a glamorous party, not under flashing cameras, but in a very human moment when both of them had just come out of broken marriages and both understood what it meant to be exhausted from having to appear strong. Anne Bancroft was not drawn to Mel Brooks's loudness. She was drawn to the intelligence behind it, to his ability to see through people, and to a sadness that was carefully hidden. They married in 1964. No spectacle, no need to prove anything, just two people choosing to stay. Anne became something Mel Brooks had never had before, an anchor who did not require him to always be cheerful, someone strong enough to let him be silent when he needed to be. Brooks would later call her the Obi-Wan Kenobi of his life, a quiet guide who never needed the spotlight. And it was within that sense of safety that Mel Brooks dared to take risks again. He wrote The Producers, a film no major studio believed in, a comedy about Hitler, an idea deemed unacceptable. Hollywood laughed at him. Some Jewish rabbis wrote letters condemning him, but Anne did not. She didn't ask whether he was afraid. She asked only, "Do you believe in what you're doing?" Mel Brooks didn't just believe. He understood why he had to do it. The Producers premiered in 1967. Its initial box office was modest, but the film won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, a recognition Mel Brooks had never dared to imagine. More importantly, it affirmed one truth: comedy can touch forbidden ground if it comes from truth. What followed were the years Mel Brooks once thought would never come. Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, films that didn't just make audiences laugh, they redefined American comedy. Amid shooting schedules, scripts, and the pressure of fame, Anne Bancroft was always there. Not as a shadow, but as a pillar. In 1972, they welcomed a son, Max, a family built not on ambition, but on understanding. While Mel Brooks's career soared, his private life, for the first time, did not collapse. Not because he became less funny, but because he no longer used laughter as a way to escape. Mel Brooks's golden era was not defined only by awards, not only by classic films. It was a rare period in his life when he could create freely and still have a place to return to without having to perform. But every light casts a shadow, and as success reached its peak, as power and expectation converged, Mel Brooks was about to face another test, this time not from the outside, but from the fragility of the very summit on which he stood. After the years of brilliance, Mel Brooks entered a phase rarely mentioned when people speak of legends, not one of glamorous premieres, but of quiet missteps, one after another. Success creates a dangerous illusion that you cannot lose. Mel Brooks kept working relentlessly, still writing, still directing, but the rhythm of public taste had shifted, and comedy, once his weapon, began to backfire. Several films failed to meet expectations. Praise grew sparse. Doubt crept into the very boardrooms that once welcomed him as a hero. Then came Solar Babies, a science fiction project Brooks joined as an executive producer, not because he believed it was a masterpiece, but because he believed his experience and reputation would be enough to save it. The budget ballooned from a few million to more than $20 million, and when the film was released, it collapsed spectacularly. Box office returns were almost non-existent. Critics showed no mercy, and worst of all, Mel Brooks had to shoulder the losses himself. He mortgaged his house, borrowed money, strained to keep everything standing. There were nights when the man who once made the entire world laugh sat alone with cold numbers and thoughts he had never dared to admit before. Years later, Brooks said bluntly, "I was almost ready to jump off the roof." Not because he feared ridicule, but because, for the first time in his life, laughter could no longer pay the bills. This is the moment every legend dreads, when you realize you could lose everything and no one can guarantee you'll ever return. Yet in the middle of that crisis, one thing did not collapse. Anne Bancroft. She didn't urge him to make another film, didn't push him to prove anything. She was there, as she had always been, quiet, steady, and never demanding that he be funny. Mel Brooks didn't bounce back immediately. He slowed down, accepted that he was no longer invincible, and for the first time, he allowed himself to grow old. Not old in years, but old in understanding that every summit has its price, and a career, no matter how great, cannot replace peace. But life was not finished with Mel Brooks, because the greatest trial would not come from money, not from box office numbers. It would come from the place he least expected, the home that had been his anchor for more than 4 decades. And when that door finally closed, Mel Brooks would be forced to learn one last lesson, not about comedy, but about loss. Some losses do not shake the world. They create no scandal. They never make front-page headlines. But for Mel Brooks, this was the moment when everything truly fell silent. In 2005, Anne Bancroft passed away from cancer, not after a dramatic accident, not beneath stage lights, but in a hospital room, where fame holds no value at all. They had been together for more than 40 years. Not a marriage built on noisy headlines, but a relationship forged through profound understanding. Anne was not just Mel Brooks' wife. She was the only person who never required him to be funny, the one who saw the man behind the jokes, who knew when to listen and when to let him be silent. Brooks once said, "Anne was the Obi-Wan Kenobi of his life." Not because she led him toward glory, but because she kept him standing when the light went out. When Anne died, Mel Brooks did not collapse in public. He did not recount his pain. He did not turn grief into a monologue. He disappeared from laughter. For the first time in decades, the man who once filled every room with sound was left facing a home that was unbearably quiet. No one asking what he was writing. No one reminding him to take care of his health. No one who understood that behind every joke was an unspoken worry waiting to surface. Their son, Max, later shared that only as an adult did he realize his family was not like the rest of the world. Not because they were famous, but because of the energy, the humor, and the closeness, things that only existed when both parents were still there. After Anne Bancroft's death, Mel Brooks did not remarry, not because he turned away from love, but because he understood a simple and brutal truth. Some relationships cannot be replaced, and some empty spaces do not need to be filled. They only need to be accepted. Brooks still appeared in public, still smiled, still joked, but those close to him knew. From that moment on, his laughter was no longer the same. It was slower, quieter, and it carried something the audience could not see. Remembrance. This loss did not end Mel Brooks's life, but it closed a chapter. The only chapter in his life where laughter and peace had once existed side by side. And when that chapter ended, Mel Brooks stepped into the final phase of his journey. No longer a battle for recognition, but a quiet dialogue with legacy and with himself. As time began to slow, Mel Brooks no longer had to prove who he was. The world had already done that for him. Awards lined the shelves. Titles were repeated again and again. EGOT. 4 letters only a handful of artists in history have ever reached. But if you ask Mel Brooks what makes him proudest, the answer is not found in a display case. He does not see himself as a genius. He calls himself someone close to a genius. Not false humility, but the clarity of someone who understands that talent cannot save anyone from loneliness, and fame cannot replace the presence of another human being. Brooks's films, The Producers, Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, Spaceballs, are not merely comedies. They are living arguments for a philosophy. Evil cannot be destroyed by fear, but it can be made small through laughter. He taught an entire generation that humor is not meant to escape reality, but to face it without being crushed. Even as age pulled him away from relentless production schedules, Mel Brooks continued to appear. Slower, calmer. No longer charging into rapid-fire jokes, but choosing short lines that leave long echoes. He once said, "Humor is a defense mechanism against the universe." A line that may sound light, but when you look back at his life, from a boy who lost his father, to a Jewish soldier in wartime, to an artist who faced bankruptcy, to a man who lost the only partner who truly understood him, you realize this was not a stage philosophy. It was a survival instinct. Mel Brooks's legacy does not rest solely in laughter. It lies in the right to laugh, even when the world gives you no reason to. In his later years, Mel Brooks does not speak much about death. He speaks about living loudly, living with sound, living until living is no longer possible, because in his view, rehearsing for silence too early is a form of surrender. And perhaps that is Mel Brooks's greatest legacy. Not that we will laugh forever, but that, when no other choice remains, we can still laugh. In the end, the story of Mel Brooks does not ask us to admire him any further. Fame has already done that more than enough, nor does it ask us to place him in some temple of immortality. Because Mel Brooks himself understands one thing very clearly: no one defeats time. What remains, and perhaps what matters most, is what he leaves behind for those who never stood under the stage lights. A boy who lost his father before he could even remember his face. A Jewish soldier who entered war carrying a nameless fear. An artist who collapsed under anxiety, went bankrupt through mistakes, and stayed silent for a long time after losing the only woman who ever truly understood him. Yet through all of it, Mel Brooks did not choose bitterness. He did not choose hatred, and he did not choose silence. He chose laughter, not to deny pain, but to avoid being swallowed by it. Perhaps that is Mel Brooks's final message to the world. You do not need to be a hero to survive. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to laugh, even when no one tells you that you should. And as this video comes to a close, we want to leave you with a question. One with no right or wrong answer. In your life, what has laughter ever saved you from? If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you can continue this journey with us, diving deep into real lives, behind the lights, behind the fame, and behind the people who once changed the world. Because sometimes what keeps us holding on to life is not an answer at all, but a perfectly timed laugh.